Okay, this lesson for the Cornet Project class, it's just a question, but it's very thought-provoking. Luke chapter 7, verse 30. Again, if you go to controversial texts, you'll find energy for all the work you'll need to put into translating it out, wording it out, researching the terms. So that's why I recommend when you begin studying, let's say, Bible language, English, Greek, and Hebrew, then find those areas of controversy. So in this one, I'm just asking a question because we can relax a little. We've studied enough years now. So I just said, riddle me this, riddle me that. How can a Calvinist resist? And it's to provoke thought, of course. And in this text, how does a Calvinist resist scriptural baptism? And it's to cause us to ponder what is it about, let's say, major apologist, very credible pastors, like let's say a Dr. John MacArthur. He's Baptist, appeals to the 1689 London Baptist Confession. So he's Baptist. Al Mohler, probably one of the leading among Southern Baptists. So ecclesiology, according to ecclesiology, they both affirm a Baptistic ecclesiology. Dr. James R. White, the world's leading apologist, scholar, linguist, all whatever else, hermeneutics, interpretation, professor, teacher, scholastic, Reformed Baptist. So he adheres to Baptist ecclesiology. Dr. Leighton Flowers, Southern Baptist apologist, Baptist churches, Grace Evangelical Society, very much support for local churches, assemblies. So that you notice when it comes to ecclesiology, which is a demonstrable outward expression of what is often affirmed today adamantly about lordship. So how could people who are of the adherence and practice that corresponds to the ecclesiastic community in the New Testament, which is the covenant community since the days of Christ, and that's a fact. The New Testament church letters written to churches, you know that from hermeneutics. So the question was, how do people resist, let's say, people that say they're Calvinists? But let me just do the lesson first. This is definite article, plural. This is that post-positive conjunction. But the Pharisees, now this is a transliteration. When you see this word here, Pharisees and the lawyers, notice that lawyers, and this is the council. This is objective case, the council, or determinate counsel. Misspelled my definite article there. Of the God. This is that word from atheteo. I may be misspelling it, but the point is they displaced it. That displaced. It's from a negative particle and then tithemi, the position or place. So they nullified the position, displaced the determinate counsel of the God. And this is unto themselves. Unto themselves. And then here, of course, not. This is an aorist passive participle. So we'll just put when. Sometimes it's translated after, but when they would not be, I'll just write it out, baptized, transliterate for the moment. Baptized by him. This is referring to John's baptism. And why I say it is because it's noteworthy that the Galatians, those churches in the southern region of Galatia, had so quickly transposed themselves away from the one who called them by an unmerited favor from Christ that Paul was marveling, and he called them into question and informed them they had been bewitched, that the persuasion, Galatians 5:8, was not from God. He had to tell them that because they were influenced, persuaded, and it wasn't a persuasion from God. It was deception. So again, they're regenerated people, and you remember the emphasis that we hear in dispute today, or often disputed and bantered and frictioned, is about resistible or irresistible. And yet it's noteworthy to notice that when I ask the question, and I do it to ascertain and elicit from the hearer, do they have any knowledge of the text, Luke 7, verse 30? And I ask people, how do you resist? And I say a Calvinist, for example, who are known for advocating, affirming adamantly irresistible grace. And that's not the topic. This topic is, what's the rationale for a Calvinist? Since High Calvinist Dr. James R. White doesn't resist scriptural baptism, he's an elder in one of the covenant communities, as he affirms himself to be, and you can research that. And he promotes the keeping of the ordinances, the baptizing of those who believe the gospel. Dr. John MacArthur, the same. Dr. Leighton Flower. Just go down the list of all these prominent people, and then ask yourself, it's a good question, what finds people who are regenerated, as in the churches in Galatia, so inclined to seem to be immunized to irresistible grace after regeneration? So much so that in the church letter to Corinth, we have people there, one sporting about with his father's wife. Now, again, people will have a rationale. Some say, well, they're not really regenerated. Some have gone so far as to even say some of the churches to whom the letters are written in the book of Revelation were not regenerated, because, again, it calls for a rationale. What is the rationale? How can someone say, let's say the late R.C. Sproul, that people, let's say like John Piper, he's Baptist. He has, let's say he admires an R.C. Sproul of a Presbyterian ecclesiology, Protestant, or a Dr. John MacArthur has admiration or kinship or friendship, whatever you call it, historically a legacy of great friendship with R.C. Sproul. Well, why the question is asked is because you hear a lot of advocacy for lordship salvation, so people who are in a covenant community might be disparaged because they use language of this culture and may use a phrase free will and have no idea they're speaking of causal agency according to the inflectional morpheme in the Bible language. But you'll hear a lot of banter, and yet these people are in the faith, practicing outwardly, demonstrably, that which you can see, as James said. You see, therefore, the word blepo with the eyes. So really, what is the rationale? How does someone resist? If you're an advocate of irresistible grace, how is it that God, when you're unregenerate, seems to want absolute, demonstrable, sovereign prerogative in your regeneration, but then anything afterward, let's say for pragmatic reasons, your sanctification, you never come out, sever your ties, you never unite, or you're never elected in the body. And then you hear dispute about election, but we never notice a lot of emphasis on the purpose for which a person's reasoned out from the called out. So until you're called out, well, you're called, invited, ecclesia, called out, the word ex, you've made your exit, you've accepted the invitation. Now, as those who are called out, you're now reasoned out for a particular purpose to be accomplished in that ecclesia, through that ecclesia, and in accordance with the ecclesia. So it's a good question. It's just when you go through this and you hear things being disputed and sovereign decrees and determinate counsel and a lot of things that are really worthy of discussion, notice here, these religionists here had explained away and nullified God's determinate counsel, displaced it unto themselves when they would not be baptized by him, speaking of John the Baptist. So, and maybe someone will tell you, well, it was water baptism no longer for today. Now that's their rationale for how do they resist. Or as, let's say, Reformed who aren't of a Baptist ecclesiology? What is their rationale? It's a good question. And it also, when you can cite this text, it means you've thought about this. It means you've looked up the terms. It means you've asked yourself today, why is it that the leading apologists, leading advocates of rationale for the Bible, the Scriptures, are all Baptist? Literally, they're Baptist. And they are world renowned. I mean, there's really no one that wouldn't know of these people. So to be consistent, as we're doing here in the Coronate Project class, when Lordship salvation, for example, whatever that might mean to whomever and according to whatever degree or extent to which they support that or renounce it, it still begs the question, if there is something demonstrable that we would admire in people, it would be, did they trust Jesus Christ for everlasting life? Yes or no? And if they did, then did they come out from all that which the blood of Christ purchased them, just as we have in typology in the Old Testament, lamb's blood's placed over the doorpost, and those redeemed, purchased by that blood, came out. They were all baptized into Moses, 1 Corinthians 10, we're baptized into Christ. So Ephesians 5:32 says, the ecclesia, that is Christ. We have in the letter to the churches in Galatia, as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. So we believe into Jesus Christ, Galatians 2:16. We trust Jesus Christ for everlasting life. Then we're baptized into Christ, that is the ecclesia. And I don't mean baptized as the verb that is speaking of being merged by the gospel. I was speaking of being water baptized, which there's no regenerative water baptism anywhere in the Scriptures. So that places the Lutheran construct. Luther's idea is obviously skewed, and then advocates of baptismal regeneration, but for want of a text, but back to, if someone's trusted Jesus, they come out through baptism, they're united and elected into a body there locally under the headship of Christ, into Christ's body. They've taken on the identity of Christ in that body. They're being discipled, growing, learning. So how would a Calvinist, hypothetically speaking, how would they resist that? And what would be their rationale? And have they ever been asked? Because I was always curious about it, because I've known people who would quote 5 points. They could hardly remember the acronym TULIP. But then when I'd ask them about their disconnection from that which the sheep are involved in, receiving the green grass, enjoying the still waters, growing in the grace and knowledge, assuring Christ's interest on this earth, which were the same as while he was here during his earthly ministry, and that is, namely, that his Father received the glory, and that's by him in the ecclesia. So it's a good question, it's a good lesson. It will help you in dialogue with your friends, because you won't find very many people that don't. There's a lot more people that affirm themselves to be Calvinist, self-identity, appropriation, whatever you call that, and would never even notice these things. So that's why we're studying, to learn, and then for us to first find our own interest in this and see the value that the Bible adds and gives to it. And then to ask yourself, well, why are the world's leading apologists Baptist? Why are people so? And then what I found was rather inconsistent was sometimes you'll see leading Calvinist Baptists, let's say like a Dr. MacArthur, spending more time perhaps rebuking or chiding or maybe speaking against, let's say, Baptists, independent Baptists, because they don't seem to think those people who are assembled together under the headship of Christ, faithfully carrying out the ordinances, outwardly, demonstrably showing their faith by that outward work and exertion they're making, as James said. And yet it doesn't seem to sate those who say, but we still want you to appropriate the fallible construct that we use in acronym and associate in accordance to a Catholic priest named John Calvin. So I'm not sure that Baptist apologists have caught up with the inconsistency, especially when the wave of lordship came through. I don't think we can often see in ourselves why we you would suppose an advocate of lordship, that is, of demonstrable outward conduct of a sheep, would really be admiring independent Baptist churches, local churches, the faithfulness of people to persist to assemble faithfully under Christ's headship, even through global pandemic, and would cast aside the silliness of a fallible construct like some cheap cookie cutter that you want to make sure everyone has one, so that when they cut out their little cookies, everybody's construct looks like the face of John Calvin. So I don't mean to do that. It's just sometimes it's just a good question to ask. It tells you how much you really know about what's really going on in the Bible. So enjoy this lesson, and hope I didn't take too long to convey it.